All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about some kind of high level interview basics, just kind of skimming through some of the core essentials that you'll want to know before you actually land that first interview. So, today, let's go ahead and get started. So, we're going to start with some fast facts. So, on average, it takes about 2 or 3 different interview sessions with the same employer before you usually are offered a job offer. Sometimes people have only had like that first initial interview, and at the end of the interview, they kind of expect that job offer. But as you kind of move on in your professional development and things like that, a lot of times it's very normal to have 2 or 3 different interviews in that process. Nowadays, especially post COVID, uh, especially at bigger companies, almost everyone conducts virtual interviews or phone interviews for that first interview. So if you're not comfortable using a computer, if you've never used Zoom or Teams or uh, Google Meet or something like that, and you have no idea what you're doing on that, it's very, very important that you start getting familiar with these because post pandemic, that is pretty much the new norm. Almost every company that's more than a few employees is going to want to have that first interview digitally or over the phone. So it's really important to get familiar with that technology before you actually have to use it. And the first 90 seconds or first minute and a half of an interview is when you have the most chance at making a positive first impression or a negative first impression. So, how you dress, how you carry yourself, how you introduce yourself, some of the things that you talk about in that first initial meet and greet, all really important ways to frame the rest of the conversation. Also, 70% of interviewers will pass on an applicant if they're wearing poor attire. So definitely make sure you know the kind of culture and dress code of the place you're going to when you're choosing the outfit that you go to. If you're going to a business job or an office job, you're going to want to dress up more than maybe you would at a job that's mostly physical labor and industrial in nature. So really, what is the employer looking for when they set up an interview? Kind of the overall purpose of this is to determine your soft skills, things that you can't just write down on paper that you kind of have to see. So, are you good at carrying a conversation? Are you confident in your abilities? Are you able to communicate well? Are you able to ask questions if you need clarification? How do you can carry yourself and relate to other people in other ways than just, hey, I can do these tasks. Job fit and culture fit. So, are you a good fit for the job and kind of the skills that are required for that? Does your personality work with both the job and also with the other people that you'll be working with? So that culture fit. Do you fit in here as well as able to do the job, basic job? And then lastly, comparing you to everyone else. It's a competition. So the interview is comparing you compared to everyone else who is also interviewing for this job. So you want to practice and make sure you hone in your skills before the interview so that you come out on the top of everyone else that's interviewing. So the way you start that is you start prepping before the interview ever even happens. So there's a couple steps I highly recommend. Do your homework on the company and on the questions they might ask. Come prepared with all of that prep work you've done. And lastly, be a star, which is an acronym, and I will get into that here in a couple slides. First of all, know what could be on the interview. So one of the best ways to do this is look at multiple job listings for the kind of job you're trying to get. If you're trying to be a CNA, look at a bunch of CNA job listings. If you're trying to be an office assistant, look at a bunch of office assistant type roles and see what the descriptions are of what the company is looking for in those roles. Uh, Anything that's listed on there as far as a skill or ability is something that could be on the interview. So what keeps showing up when you go look at 10 different job listings? What's the same across all of them? And those are probably the core things you want to focus on. You can use websites like Indeed or the Muse are two that I highly recommend to look up answers for common interview questions and why they're good reasons to answer certain ways. And then treat your upcoming interview like a test. You need to study beforehand on what could be questions that are probably going to happen. And, there's a lot of questions that are common on interviews, but you're only going to get about 10 or 15 of them actually in that first interview. So you kind of need to study more questions to be ready for the random ones that'll show up during your first interview. And another thing you can do is prep for specific questions, but also when you're prepping them, think of answering them in a specific STAR format. So we're going to break it down into 4 steps. The first step in answering a question an interviewer might have is answer with the situation that is relevant to the question. So if someone asks, hey, tell me about a time you provided good customer service. First, you want to list the situation, a specific situation that you're in, a specific story. So you don't want to do something like, oh, well, generally, if someone's upset, I'll talk to them and then I'll try to get them to calm down. No, you want a specific situation. Like last week, this actually happened last week. A customer came in and they got charged for something that they didn't buy. And it was my job to try and fix the situation because I work at the service desk. That is a good example of what laying down the situation. You're explaining it in enough detail so that the interviewer who wasn't there, doesn't know the job that you do, has an idea of the situation and how you fit into the picture without having to ask for any clarification or having to be there themselves. Then once you lay down that situation, you move on to the task. What was the goal that you had to accomplish? What were you responsible for? So in this situation with the upset customer, your end goal was to make them happy and satisfied and process, maybe return or a refund. So to explain, hey, when this customer came in, they were upset. They got charged for something that they didn't pay for. So it was my job to refund them the money and make sure that if they had any other concerns that I cleared that up. And that would be an example of the task in that situation. The next step is going to be the action. What step did you specifically do to accomplish the task that you just identified? So you have the groundwork, you have what you're responsible and what you're supposed to do. Now you're going to say what you did specifically to reach your goal. So in this situation with this customer, the specific action steps is, I followed company policy. Anytime someone is asking for a refund on something, I always have to ask them for their receipt. So I took a look at their receipt, found that the purchase was from the same day, just a few minutes ago. So I realized that our policy is if it's the same day receipt, we honor the customer if they say that they didn't get something. So I needed to have my supervisor approve the refund. Since I cannot give out cash myself, I had to follow company policy and get them to approve the refund. I approved the refund and then I followed up with the customer like, hey, we're able to refund this. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Is there any other points of concern or things that you wanted to cover today while you're here? And so that's the actions I took. I described, step by step what I did in that situation so that, again, the person who is the interviewer can hear your thought process on how you solve problems, how you handled a specific situation, and what you personally are responsible for. So they want to know if you're in a situation like this in the future, how are you going to handle it? And you being detailed and thorough in your explanation helps them get a good picture of what you'll be like in a similar situation if they hire you. And then, so you've set the groundwork, what the situation is, what your goal is. You walked through all the different steps of what those actions are. Now you're onto the result. So what was the outcome of the situation? So this is a lot of spot where a lot of people kind of leave out of their stories, but this is really key to making a good impression and making you look better than everyone else. So think of the stories that have positive results. So in this scenario we've been working with, think of, what the customer's reaction and outcome of that interaction was. So hopefully it was a positive experience. So in this one, we'll say, because I was patient and apologized with the customer, they realized it wasn't my fault, but I was willing to help them and kind of help them with whatever they needed with the refund and other things of that nature, and that I was willing to listen to them. They calmed down during our transaction while we were waiting for my manager to approve it. And so, I took, at the beginning, they were upset and angry, but by the time they left, they were thanking me like, thanks so much. You've been a big help. I still plan on coming back here because of the way that you treated me. And that was the result. So you're not just highlighting what you did, but you're proving that you were good at what you did by showing a positive result. So always tie in the outcome and try to think of stories that have good outcomes so that you can take credit for them. Because that's really what you want to do, is not just say, oh yeah, I did X, Y, and Z. I helped people at the counter when they needed help. But you also want to say, prove evidence that you can do that and do it really well. So give the results, give a story that wraps up nicely, that puts you in a positive light. And that's what I mean but when you use the STAR technique, is to tie all of these individual pieces together so that you have one giant story that shows all of your thought process and actions and how you provided a positive outcome for everyone involved. So again, just highlighting a little bit more on this, be specific. If you don't say something, it's as if you never did it. Interviewers aren't going to read between the lines. If you don't say it, they're going to think it's not important or it's not something that you do. So it's basically as if you never did it, even though you might do it every day. Be positive, again, on those outcomes and interactions. Always try to think of examples that have positive outcomes that make you look good, that you did your job well. Uh, so always highlight that instead of the negative, just because, again, it'll influence what they think of you and how they perceive your ability to do your job well. Focus on your results. So if you say, hey, I did these things, but you don't say any of the outcomes, they're going to have no information to go off of, whether you were good or bad. There's no outcome of the stories you tell. They don't know what the outcome is going to be when they hire you at this place. And they don't want to take that risk. So they'll just say, okay, we'll move on to the next person who can show evidence that they've done something and they've done it well and had a good outcome. And practice. So learning a new technique or learning a new skill always takes time and practice. So it's going to take time to think of those stories and then start practicing those stories from those 4 different steps. So start with the situation and moving on to the task and then the action and then the result. Work on your stories and framing them that way. And the more you practice that, the more natural it'll feel when you're in a stressful interview environment. So again, if you made it to the interview, you've done a lot of things right. It takes a lot to kind of get through some of the filters and things like that. So you want to make sure that you're taking every opportunity to also make a positive interview impression in person. So when you're, whether in person or virtually, make sure you're dressing for the interview environment. If you're not sure what the dress code is, it's always better to dress more formal than less formal if you aren't sure what it is. Try to stay more traditional, more conservative. Again, you don't want your clothes being the thing that stands out. You want to stand out as your personality and who you are and the skills you bring. And obviously make an effort, put effort into looking good, makeup, putting your hair up, being well clean, well shaven, everything's ironed, all of that. So some interview attire possibilities or combinations for women would look like this. Again, you'll kind of see they're more on the conservative side, nothing above the knees, higher top shirts and dresses, more pale colors, or if there's bright colors, it's more of an accent than the entire outfit. For men, it'll be similar. I would say anything on this range is fine. Uh, Basically, some sort of button-up preferably long sleeve with the collar down. You could wear a tie, you could wear a full-on suit. So depending on the kind of job you're going for, might make it more appropriate to wear one of these than other, whether it's like a business, more office style job, you probably dress a little nicer than if it's like for an auto mechanic or something where you're doing physical labor. Then it might be more on the left where you just wear a nice pair of jeans, khakis, and a polo or a button up shirt. So again, kind of wear neutral colors, navy, dark grays, black is best. Suits are never a bad option. If you have something flashy, keep it to an accent, small amount of your outfit, and things like that. Thinking about when the day of the interview, know exactly where you're going and how long it takes to get there. I always suggest going there before you actually have the interview, so you can account for, if it's on a big campus or a big building, you're not stressing yourself out hunting down an office in a big, complex like at a hospital or something like that. Leave yourself as much extra time as possible. Things always happen. Cars break down, buses are late, traffic happens, trains, slow down the way to get there. So leave yourself extra time so that while you're already nervous to interview, you're not making yourself even more stressed by having a time crunch. And then just realize that you don't know who's in traffic, or who has a say on the interview. So once you leave your house, I say, mentally say, hey, my interview's already started, because I don't know who I'm going to run into that might have a say on whether or not I have this job or not. So again, if you remember nothing else, highly recommend remembering the stars. So situation, task, action, and finally the result. And try to answer your questions in that format, and you'll be as good as gold. And here we have some additional tips as well. So, you know, for virtual interviews, make sure you know your technology, make sure it all works well. Run through a checklist, do a practice run before. Check your environment and things like that, because again, you're responsible for setting up your area. And so if you can't be bothered to ensure that your place is distraction free and everything works, that's going to be reflected in their perception of you as your ability to do a thorough job on the job. With for phone interviews, again, make sure that your voicemail is open and free if they need to contact with you, that it's a professional voicemail. And then also before the interview, review the job. And then if you need any visual aids or notes, you can have them in front of you. That's totally fine. Interviews are much shorter, so be prepared for 30 minutes or less with just a few questions. So kind of keep that in mind, and maybe practice timing yourself on some of the more common interview questions. All right, and then that is it. There is some additional resources if you want to email me a common interview question. There's plenty of resources online that you can look up. So I highly recommend going on Indeed or the Muse to find those kinds of resources. There's plenty, and you can never spend enough time practicing interviews and asking for feedback.